On a cold night in 1922, in Germany, there was a lonely farm called Hinterkaifeck. Hidden away in the fog, this isolated place became the scene of a horrifying crime. A whole family was mysteriously murdered inside their own home with an axe. But this wasn't just a regular killing. At the farm, investigators found strange footprints, unsettling clues, and unanswered questions. What's even more disturbing is that, even after brutally killing all 6 family members, the murderer didn't leave. Instead, he stayed there for days, eating their food, cleaning up the house, and even taking care of the animals. Tonight, we're going to dive into this unbelievable case. So get ready, turn on the universe mode in your brain, because nothing in the outside world should disturb you as we step into this chilling story. It was March of 1922, in the cold, damp nights of Bavaria, Germany. The Hinterkaifeck farm sat in the middle of wide fields and thick forests. The farm belonged to the Gruber family. Everyone in the area knew them. They were wealthy, but also carried a very bad reputation. The head of the household was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, a harsh, violent man who had made many enemies. His wife, Cecilia, was calmer but often anxious about everything. Their daughter, Victoria, was just 22 years old. She had suffered a lot, her husband had died during the war, and so she had moved back into her parents' house with her 2 children, little Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and a 2-year-old son. The family also had a maid named Maria, and sadly, the night of the murders was her very first day on the job. In the village, there were plenty of rumors about the Grubers. Andreas was notorious for being cruel. He constantly fought with neighbors and was known to beat his workers and servants. On top of that, people whispered about his disturbing relationship with his own daughter. Many suspected Andreas and Victoria had been involved in an incestuous relationship, one that began when Victoria was only 16. Some even believed that's why her husband had left her to fight at the front in the first place. The local priest eventually discovered what was happening and reported it. Andreas was sentenced to a year of hard labor for incest, while Victoria was sentenced to a month in prison, since, at the time, women involved in such cases were punished as if they were prostitutes. But this punishment didn't change Andreas. After he returned to the farm, he went right back to his old ways. Not long after, Victoria became pregnant again. Andreas claimed that the father wasn't him, but their neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz's wife had recently died, and he admitted he had been seeing Victoria. Because of that, he was forced to acknowledge the child and pay child support. Still, most villagers doubted his story. Even though Lorenz paid support, he always denied the boy was actually his. The little boy was so frail that, even at the age of 2, he was the size of a newborn. Some thought this might have been due to genetic problems linked to the suspected incest in the family. So now you have a picture of the Gruber household. Let's get into the strange events that led up to the murders. In early March, Andreas started noticing bizarre things. One day, he spotted a trail of footprints in the snow leading straight to the farm. But what shook him was that there were no footprints leading back out, just tracks going in. At night, he heard noises inside the house, the creaking of old wooden stairs, as if someone was walking around upstairs. When he went to check, he found nothing. The family's longtime maid had already quit because of things like this. She told Victoria, "There's someone hiding in this house. At night I feel like someone is breathing next to me that I can't see." Terrified, she swore never to set foot on the farm again. A few days later, Victoria noticed things missing from her locked drawers. She also heard footsteps inside the house. On another day, she even saw the silhouette of a strange man. Meanwhile, Cecilia said that sometimes at night, she could hear the sound of children crying. The family grew uneasy, but Andreas dismissed all of it. "Stop this nonsense. It's just your imagination." Still, he himself seemed disturbed. He even mentioned these strange happenings to the neighbors. But here's the real mystery: if he was so unsettled, why didn't he take it more seriously? At the time, Andreas didn't see any signs of robbery or theft, so he couldn't say a burglar had been hanging around his farm. Victoria, however, didn't think this was just a coincidence. She even went to the local priest and confessed that she feared demons or some evil presence was haunting the farm. By the last week of March, things escalated. At night, the animals on the farm grew restless and started making strange noises. From the barn, the family began hearing footsteps again. They went to investigate, but, as always, no one was there. On March 31st, the family sat down together for dinner as usual. But that night was different. That night carried with it the shadow of something sinister. It was also Maria's very first day working on the farm. She asked Victoria about the rumors she'd heard, but Victoria couldn't bring herself to answer. Instead, she broke down crying. Later that evening, one by one, members of the family headed out to the barn, possibly to check on something they had heard. And one by one, they never returned. By nightfall, not a sound came from the Gruber household. It wasn't until April 4, 1922, that anyone came by. A repairman named Albert Hoffner arrived to fix some farm equipment, as the Grubers had requested. Since nobody came out to meet him, Hoffner simply found the tools himself and worked for about 4 hours. But the silence of the farm started to bother him. Finally, he decided to look for the family. He searched around the house but saw no one. Confused, he left and went to a neighbor, none other than Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the man rumored to be the father of Victoria's son. Lorenz was already uneasy about not hearing from the Grubers. He and 2 other men joined Hoffner and headed back to the farm. What they found was beyond horrific. All 6 members of the household, including the maid, had been slaughtered with an axe. Blood trails stretched from the barn to the house. But here's the terrifying twist: after the murders, someone had been living there. The killer stayed for days. He lit fires in the stove, cooked meals, cleaned parts of the house, and even fed the animals. Just inside the barn entrance, 4 bodies were discovered: Andreas, his wife Kazilia, Victoria, and 7-year-old little Kazilia. Their faces had been beaten beyond recognition. Disturbingly, their corpses had been neatly stacked and covered with straw. A short time later, the rest were found. Inside the house, 2-year-old Joseph had been killed in his crib, and Maria, the maid, was murdered in her room with a crushing blow to the head. By the time the police arrived, the killer was long gone. Search dogs were brought in, but the trail was lost deep in the forest. The authorities launched a massive investigation and even offered a reward of 100,000 marks, roughly $526 at the time, which would equal around $9,000-10,000 today. Weapon, a bloody mattock, a type of axe, was recovered from the barn. Strangely, there were no fingerprints on it. Even stranger, nothing had been stolen. All the valuables were still in place. This meant the murders were not about money. They were personal. What shocked investigators the most was how casually the killer seemed to move about the house afterward, living among the dead as if nothing had happened. In Victoria's hand, they found a tightly clenched piece of paper with lines written on it, though it made no sense and was never deciphered. Meanwhile, locals reported seeing strange lights on the farm at night after the murders, and some claimed they heard noises coming from the property. A few even said they saw suspicious figures around the area, though no one could ever identify them. Investigators also learned of the warnings given by the previous maid, who had quit because she felt unsafe in the house. She once said, "There's evil hidden inside that home." This only fueled theories that the murders might not have been entirely human in nature. At first, the police suspected the former maid herself, but she had a solid alibi and was eventually cleared. Another theory pointed toward Victoria's mysterious lover, or the unknown father of Joseph. Maybe a past affair or a personal grudge had led to the massacre. But the truth was, no one could ever say for sure who that person was. If this crime had happened today, DNA testing might have solved it. But this was the early 20th century, and the mystery of Hinterkaifeck was destined to remain unsolved. At that time, DNA testing didn't exist. It was still decades away from even being developed. So investigators had no way to use science to narrow down suspects. That meant the killer stayed on the list of possibilities, but finding him was nearly impossible. Some strangers who had passed through the area were suspected, but nothing concrete ever came of it. What stood out most was how the murderer had remained on the farm for several days after the killings, never stealing a thing, moving carefully and deliberately. This was no ordinary criminal. The brutality of the murder suggested deep hatred, or a disturbed mind. The more investigators looked into it, the stranger the case became. Was this simply a crime of rage, or something far more twisted? Early in the investigation, police identified several possible suspects. But one by one, each theory fell apart. Let's walk through them. 1. Victoria's secret lover. After her husband's death in the war, Victoria was rumored to have been involved with another man. She never revealed who the father of her son Joseph really was. That mystery created tension both inside and outside the family. Could she have been protecting someone's identity? Someone within the household? At one point, Victoria had even written a letter, which she gave to a young girl on her way to school. In it, she warned about a coming danger. The letter was meant to be delivered to someone in the village, but it never arrived. By the time it was found, it was too damaged to read. 2. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The neighbor, Lorenz, was one of the first suspects. He had been romantically involved with Victoria and was believed by some to be Joseph's father. Forced at one point to acknowledge the child, he may have held resentment. Suspicion grew when Lorenz took charge of the search party and was among the first to enter the barn where the bodies were found. Some villagers thought he was acting as if he already knew what he would find. During questioning, his calm demeanor and odd remarks about the crime raised further doubts. Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, was believed to have died in World War I. But wartime communication was often unclear, and rumors spread that perhaps he hadn't died at all. Some wondered, had he faked his death, returned in secret, and murdered his family in a jealous rage after discovering Victoria's affairs? Official records, however, concluded that Carl had indeed died in the war. Still, even decades later, people claimed to have spotted him alive. Maybe it was sloppy investigating, or maybe Carl's ghost lingered in the public imagination because the case was so haunting. 4. The former maid, Crescent Rieger. The maid who quit before Maria replaced her was another possible suspect. She had fled the farm after being terrified by strange occurrences. But maybe her fear had turned into anger. Perhaps she wanted revenge on the Grubers for the way she had been treated. She knew the farm well, knew its secrets, and had first-hand experience of the family's cruelty. Could she have snapped and carried out the killings? Investigators looked into it, but she too was cleared. 5. A random stranger. Finally, some believed the killer might have been a drifter, someone hiding in the woods, who stumbled onto the farm and killed the family after being discovered. The isolated location would have made it a perfect temporary hideout. But this theory had flaws. If the killer only wanted to silence witnesses, why murder a 2-year-old child? Joseph was too young to remember anything. His killing suggested something more personal, something fueled by hatred. For decades, the case remained a dark mystery. But then, in 2007, a breakthrough of sorts came. Students at the Bavarian Police Academy were given the Hinterkaifeck murders as a cold case assignment. Using modern investigative techniques, they re-examined the evidence. What they found pointed strongly toward one suspect. Their professor confirmed that the conclusion was solid. But because the suspect's descendants are still alive, out of respect, the name was never made public. And so, the truth remains officially hidden. The farm itself was demolished in 1923, just a year after the murders. Today, nothing remains of the Gruber property. So here we are, left only with theories, speculation, and unanswered questions. Who do you think was responsible? Was it a bitter neighbor seeking revenge? A jealous husband who never died? Or someone entirely different? Whoever it was, they left behind one of the most chilling mysteries in true crime history.